Move to the back. I don't care what that boarding pass says. People like you belong in economy, not up here disrupting real passengers.
People like you belong in economy, not up here disrupting real passengers. Captain Derek Mitchell's voice cut through the first-class cabin of Skywing Airlines Flight 382 like a blade through silk. His words weren't whispered or muttered under his breath. They were delivered with the full authority of his position, loud enough for every passenger in the cabin to hear, sharp enough to wound, and certain enough to humiliate. The Boeing 737-800 sat grounded at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, delayed by weather, but about to be delayed by something far more damaging. At 6:47 p.m. on a Monday evening, with 43 passengers already seated and settled, Captain Mitchell stood in the aisle of first class, his crisp white uniform immaculate, his silver-threaded hair perfectly styled beneath his cap, his authority rehearsed and his judgment already rendered. He was looking down at a woman in seat 2A. Her name was Simone Crawford, though he didn't know it yet. What he saw was a black woman 48 years old wearing simple business casual clothing, a navy blazer over dark jeans, comfortable flats, and carrying a practical leather briefcase. What he didn't see was that she owned the airline he worked for. Simone looked up slowly from her phone, her eyes calm and unblinking. She didn't scramble to defend herself. She didn't raise her voice or gesture wildly. She simply met his stare with the kind of quiet strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are, even when someone else has decided you don't belong. "Sir," she said evenly, her voice carrying just far enough to reach the passengers around her. "I'm in my assigned seat." Captain Mitchell laughed. It was a short, ugly sound that made several passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Assigned by who? He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper that somehow managed to fill the cabin. "Let me guess. Some last-minute miracle upgrade. Some charity giveaway. This isn't a storybook, sweetheart. It's Monday night, not Christmas morning." Behind him, flight attendant Isabella Martinez stood frozen by the galley, her hands gripping a clipboard so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She was 29. Latina, a single mother working 2 jobs to support her daughter, and she had seen this before. Not exactly this, but close enough. The tone, the assumptions, the way authority could be wielded like a weapon against someone who looked different, someone who didn't fit the unspoken profile of who belonged where. In seat 3B, Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a cardiologist from Houston, slowly lowered her medical journal. She was 34, Hispanic, and she recognized what was happening because she had lived it. The assumptions, the challenges to her presence in spaces where her credentials should have spoken for themselves, the exhausting reality of having to prove her right to exist in rooms where others were simply welcomed. Across the aisle in 1C, James Sullivan, a white corporate lawyer from Atlanta, looked up from his laptop. At 41, he was successful, well-traveled, and accustomed to first-class service. But something about the captain's tone made him uncomfortable. This wasn't standard procedure. This was personal. "I purchased this ticket 3 weeks ago," Simone said, calmly reaching into her blazer pocket. "Would you like to see the confirmation?" Captain Mitchell waved her off dismissively. "Lady, I've been flying for 18 years. I've seen every scam, every fake boarding pass, every charity case trying to talk their way into seats they can't afford. You want to play games, fine, but not on my aircraft." He turned toward the rear of the plane and raised his voice. "Flight attendant, we need security up here. We have a passenger situation." Isabella Martinez felt her stomach drop. She knew what a passenger situation meant, and she knew it wasn't what was happening here. What was happening here was wrong, but Captain Mitchell was her superior, and she was 6 months away from qualifying for the company health insurance that would cover her daughter's asthma medication. "Captain," she said, carefully stepping forward, "perhaps we could verify the passenger's ticket in the system." Mitchell didn't even look at her. "Ms. Martinez, when I need input from crew, I'll ask for it. Right now, I need you to make the call. Before we continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever been humiliated by someone who didn't know you owned the company they worked for? Have you ever been judged dismissed or told you didn't belong somewhere before they knew who you truly were? If so, drop your experience in the comments because what happens next will restore your faith in justice and remind you that dignity should never depend on someone knowing your position. In seat 4A, an elderly black couple. Eleanor and Frank Washington exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They were both 71 retired teachers from Birmingham, Alabama, and they had lived through enough decades to recognize the sound of prejudice dressed up as procedure. Frank reached over and squeezed his wife's hand. They knew better than to interfere directly, but they also knew the importance of witnessing. Dr. Rodriguez pulled out her phone and opened the camera app. If this was going where she thought it was going, someone needed to document it. She angled the screen to capture both Captain Mitchell and Simone, then tapped record. "I'm sorry." Simone said, her voice still calm, but now carrying an edge of steel. "Could you explain the specific policy that requires me to move from my assigned seat?" Captain Mitchell's jaw tightened. "The specific policy is that I'm the captain of this aircraft. And when I say someone doesn't belong somewhere, they don't belong there. That's the policy." "That's not a policy," Dr. Rodriguez said quietly from across the aisle. "That's an opinion." Mitchell spun toward her, his eyes flashing. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stay in your own lane here. This doesn't concern you." "Actually," Dr. Rodriguez replied, her voice steady, "discrimination concerns everyone." The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to spread. Other passengers were looking up now, setting down their phones and books and magazines. The cabin's atmosphere had shifted from the usual pre-flight calm to something electric and uncomfortable. James Sullivan closed his laptop and leaned forward slightly. As a lawyer, he knew the legal implications of what he was witnessing. As a person, he was starting to feel sick to his stomach. Captain Simone said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife through fog, "I'm going to ask you one more time. What specific company policy requires passengers to move from their assigned seats based on your personal assessment of whether they belong there?" Mitchell's face was flushed now, his authority challenged in front of a cabin full of witnesses. "You want policy? Fine. I have the authority to remove any passenger who I deem disruptive, threatening, or inappropriate for their seating assignment. You're being disruptive by questioning my authority. You're being inappropriate by sitting in a seat that was clearly assigned to you in error." "In error?" Simone's eyebrows rose slightly. "Are you saying your airline's reservation system made a mistake?" "I'm saying mistakes happen especially around busy travel times. Systems glitch. People exploit loopholes. And I'm saying that I trust my 18 years of experience over some computer algorithm that doesn't understand the reality of aviation." Isabella Martinez felt her heart pounding. She knew she should make the call to security, but everything about this felt wrong. Captain Mitchell wasn't following any protocol she knew about. He was acting on assumption and bias, and she was being asked to be complicit. "Sir," she said quietly, "I pulled up the passenger manifest. Miss..." She glanced at her clipboard. Ms. Crawford's ticket was purchased with a platinum corporate credit card. Full fare, no upgrades or discounts. Mitchell's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Ms. Martinez, are you questioning my judgment?" "No, sir. I'm just providing information from the reservation system." "The reservation system that you just admitted could be wrong." Isabella's mouth opened, then closed. She was trapped between truth and authority, between what was right and what was expedient. Simone Crawford watched this exchange with the kind of calm that comes from having survived worse storms. At 48, she was the CEO and majority owner of Crawford Aerospace Holdings, a $4.2 billion aviation conglomerate that owned 67% of Skywing Airlines through a network of shell companies. She had boarded this flight not as a passenger, but as an investigator. For the past 6 months, Crawford Aerospace had been conducting a covert investigation into discrimination complaints filed against Skywing's Dallas to Atlanta route. 47 complaints in 5 years, all involving minority passengers, all quietly buried by the airline's legal department. The complaints had mentioned one name repeatedly: Captain Derek Mitchell. Simone had flown this route 12 times in the past 3 months, always in economy, always observing, always documenting. But tonight she had decided to book first class. She wanted to see what happened when Captain Mitchell encountered a black woman in the cabin he clearly considered his personal domain. She hadn't expected him to be quite this brazen. The irony wasn't lost on her. As a young woman 25 years ago, she had been denied boarding on this exact airline. A gate agent had looked at her student ID and said, "Scholarship kids don't buy first-class dreams." She had slept in the airport that night, her ticket confirmed, but her seat given to someone else, someone who looked the part. That humiliation had become the fuel that built an empire. Crawford Aerospace now operated 847 aircraft across 12 airlines in 6 countries. And tonight, Captain Derek Mitchell was about to discover that the woman he was trying to humiliate owned the very airline that employed him, but not yet. First, she wanted to see how far his prejudice would take him. She wanted to document every word, every assumption, every moment of bias for the federal investigators who were already monitoring this flight. Because Simone Crawford had learned something important over the past 25 years. Justice isn't about getting revenge on one person. Justice is about changing the entire structure so that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. "Captain Mitchell," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that doesn't need to shout. "I think you should reconsider your approach here." He laughed again, that same ugly sound. "Lady, the only thing I'm reconsidering is whether to have you escorted off this plane or just moved to the back where you belong. But one way or another, you're not sitting in my first-class cabin acting like you own the place." Simone Crawford smiled for the first time since the conversation began. It was a small smile, barely visible, but Dr. Rodriguez caught it on camera, and something about it made her think that Captain Mitchell had just made the biggest mistake of his life. "You're absolutely right," Captain, Simone said softly. "I shouldn't act like I own this place." Mitchell nodded smugly, thinking he had won. "I should act like I do own it," she continued. "Because I do." The words hung in the air for a moment, but Captain Mitchell wasn't listening closely enough to catch their significance. He was already turning toward the cockpit, already reaching for his radio, already planning how he would describe this difficult passenger to airport security. "Flight operations. This is Captain Mitchell on Flight 382. We need security at Gate B12. We have a passenger refusing to comply with crew instructions." But while he spoke into his radio, Simone Crawford was remembering another night 25 years earlier, when she was 23 years old and standing in this same terminal. 25 years ago, Simone had been a graduate student at MIT studying aerospace engineering on a full scholarship. She was brilliant, driven, and broke. She had saved for months to buy a first-class ticket home to Atlanta for her grandmother's funeral, using the small inheritance her grandmother had left her specifically for something special, something that shows you belong in this world. The gate agent that night had been a white woman in her 40s, blonde hair pulled back tightly, eyes that scanned Simone from head to toe and found her wanting. "I'm sorry, but there's been an error with your seat assignment," the agent had said, not sounding sorry at all. "Your ticket shows first class, but that can't be right." "I purchased first class," Simone had said, showing her confirmation number. "I have the receipt right here." "Honey," the agent had said with a condescending smile, "scholarship kids don't buy first-class dreams. You probably clicked the wrong option online. Let me move you to economy where you'll be more comfortable. But I specifically purchased first class. Look at the receipt. Receipts can be altered. Confirmation numbers can be faked. Trust me, I've seen it all. Now, do you want the economy seat, or do you want to spend the night in the airport, Simone had taken the economy seat because she had to get to her grandmother's funeral. But she had also made a promise to herself as she sat in row 23C someday she would own the airline. Someday, no one would ever question her right to be anywhere. It had taken 25 years, but she had kept that promise. Captain Derek Mitchell finished his radio call and turned back to face Simone, his expression smug and satisfied. At 52, he was a veteran pilot with 18 years of experience, all of it earned through skill and dedication. But those 18 years had also taught him things that weren't in any manual: how to spot passengers who didn't belong, how to manage situations that threatened the order of his cabin, and how to use his authority to maintain what he saw as the natural hierarchy of air travel. He had grown up in small-town Texas, the son of a mechanic and a teacher, and he had worked hard to earn his captain's wings. But somewhere along the way, that hard work had curdled into entitlement, and that entitlement had hardened into prejudice. He genuinely believed that first class was meant for people like him, people who had earned their place through traditional paths, traditional backgrounds, traditional appearances. Over the years, he had perfected the art of removing passengers who didn't fit his mental profile, a computer glitch that resulted in downgraded seats, a security concern that required additional screening, an overbooked cabin that somehow only affected minority passengers. The techniques were subtle, plausible, and effective. In 18 years, Captain Mitchell had removed 31 passengers from first class. 28 of them had been Black, Latino, or Asian. He told himself it was about maintaining standards, about protecting the airline's premium experience, about ensuring that first class remained a space where real customers felt comfortable. What he didn't know was that every single one of those incidents had been documented. Crawford Aerospace's investigation had uncovered them all: the complaints, the patterns, the carefully coded language in his reports that explained away each removal. And what he definitely didn't know was that the woman sitting in seat 2A owned the company that employed him. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez had been recording for 3 minutes now, her phone angled to capture both the captain and Simone. As a cardiologist, she was used to high-pressure situations, but this felt different. This felt like watching a structure reveal its true nature, watching power strip away pretense and show its ugly core. She had her own history with Captain Mitchell, though he wouldn't remember her. 2 years ago, she had been seated in first class on one of his flights when he had spent the entire boarding process questioning her credentials, asking to see her medical license, wondering aloud whether she had really earned her seat or if it was some kind of diversity upgrade. She hadn't filed a complaint then. She had been tired, focused on getting to a medical conference, unwilling to fight a battle she wasn't sure she could win, but she had regretted that silence ever since. Tonight felt like redemption. Isabella Martinez stood by the galley, her clipboard trembling in her hands. At 29, she was the primary breadwinner for her family, supporting her 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, and her elderly mother, Rosa. She had taken the job with Skywing because it offered health insurance and flight benefits that allowed her to visit family in Mexico. But it had also taught her harsh lessons about the cost of speaking up. 6 months ago, she had questioned a captain's decision to remove a young Latino man from first class, suggesting that they verify his ticket before calling security. She had been written up for insubordination and warned that another incident would result in termination. She needed this job, but watching Captain Mitchell humiliate this passenger was making her physically sick. "Security is en route," Mitchell announced to the cabin, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed he was solving a problem rather than creating one. "We'll have this resolved momentarily, and then we can get underway." James Sullivan, the corporate lawyer in 1C, was typing rapidly on his phone. As someone who specialized in employment law, he recognized the legal implications of what he was witnessing. Captain Mitchell wasn't following any written policy. He was acting on personal bias and using his authority to enforce it. Sullivan had seen cases like this before: employees who confused their position with their right to discriminate companies that paid millions in settlements because supervisors couldn't distinguish between legitimate authority and personal prejudice. He was already drafting an email to his firm's civil rights division. Eleanor and Frank Washington, the elderly couple in row 4, sat quietly holding hands. They were both retired teachers, veterans of the civil rights movement in Birmingham, Alabama. They had ridden freedom buses, attended integration marches, and spent their careers fighting for equality in education. They recognized what was happening because they had seen it countless times before. Authority weaponized against dignity, power used to enforce place procedure disguised as prejudice. Frank squeezed Eleanor's hand 3 times, their secret code for stay strong. Eleanor squeezed back twice, meaning, I love you. Then she pulled out her phone and began recording. 2 rows behind them, a young white college student named Tyler Morrison was live streaming the entire incident on TikTok without realizing the magnitude of what he was capturing. He had started the stream as a joke, planning to complain about flight delays, but now he was broadcasting a real-time discrimination incident to his 12,000 followers. The comments were exploding. This is messed up. Someone help her. This captain is racist. AF, why isn't anyone stopping this? Tyler looked at his viewer count. 847 people watching live. Climbing rapidly. Meanwhile, 3 rows ahead in first class, a middle-aged white businessman named Paul Henderson was watching the confrontation with growing disgust. Henderson was the regional sales director for a major pharmaceutical company, a man who prided himself on his fairness and professionalism. He had flown with Captain Mitchell before and had always been treated with deference and respect. But watching the captain's behavior toward this passenger was opening his eyes to a different reality. Was this how Mitchell treated all passengers, or just the ones who didn't look like Paul? The question made him deeply uncomfortable because he suspected he already knew the answer. Simone Crawford sat calmly in her seat, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene. To the other passengers, she might have appeared passive, even defeated, but behind her calm exterior, she was orchestrating something much larger than anyone in that cabin could imagine. The briefcase at her feet contained recording equipment that had been documenting every word of the conversation and transmitting it in real time to Crawford Aerospace's legal team. Her phone was connected to a secure network that linked her directly to federal investigators who had been monitoring Skywing Airlines for potential civil rights violations. And in 30 minutes, when Captain Mitchell least expected it, she was going to reveal who she really was and watch his entire world collapse. But first, she wanted to see how far he was willing to go. She wanted to document every assumption, every bias, every moment of discrimination for the federal case that was already being prepared. Because Simone Crawford had learned something important over the past 25 years, individual justice isn't enough. You have to change the entire structure. You have to make it impossible for what happened to you to happen to anyone else. The sound of heavy footsteps in the jet bridge announced the arrival of airport security. 2 officers appeared in the cabin doorway, a young white man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and an older black woman whose expression suggested she had seen this scenario before and didn't like how it usually ended. Captain Mitchell straightened his uniform and walked toward them with the confidence of someone who believed authority automatically meant righteousness. Officers, thank you for responding quickly. We have a passenger in seat 2A who is refusing to comply with crew instructions and causing a disturbance. The older security officer, Sergeant Patricia Williams, looked past Mitchell toward Simone. What she saw was a well-dressed black woman sitting quietly in her assigned seat, not arguing, not gesturing, not causing any kind of disturbance. What she didn't see was anything that justified a security response. But Sergeant Williams had been working airport security for 15 years, and she knew that sometimes the real disturbance wasn't coming from the passenger. Sergeant Patricia Williams stepped into the first-class cabin with the measured pace of someone who had seen this situation before. At 45, she was a 15-year veteran of airport security, a former military police officer who had learned to read situations quickly and accurately. Her partner, Officer Kevin Torres, was 26 and relatively new to the job, still learning to navigate the complex dynamics of airline passenger disputes. Williams surveyed the cabin with practiced eyes. She saw a black woman sitting calmly in her assigned seat, not shouting, not gesturing aggressively, not displaying any of the behaviors that typically accompanied actual passenger disturbances. She saw other passengers with phones out recording. She saw a flight attendant who looked more distressed than the supposed disruptive passenger. What she saw, in other words, was not what Captain Mitchell had described. "Captain," she said evenly, "what specific actions has this passenger taken that require security intervention?" Mitchell gestured toward Simone with theatrical frustration. "She's refusing to move from a seat that was clearly assigned to her by mistake. When I explained the error, she became argumentative and disruptive." Williams looked at Simone. "Ma'am, is this your assigned seat?" Simone reached into her blazer pocket and withdrew her boarding pass, handing it to the sergeant without a word. Williams examined it carefully. "Seat 2A, first class, full fare purchased 3 weeks in advance. Captain Williams said the boarding pass is valid. What error are you referring to?" Mitchell's jaw tightened. "Sergeant, I've been flying for 18 years. I know what passengers belong in first class and what passengers don't. The reservation process makes mistakes, especially with last-minute bookings and discount promotions. This ticket was purchased 3 weeks ago at full price," Williams replied, holding up the boarding pass. "There's no indication of any kind of promotion or discount." "Look," Mitchell said, his voice taking on an edge of impatience. "I don't have time to debate ticket validation with you. I'm telling you this passenger doesn't belong in first class and I need her moved." Officer Torres shifted uncomfortably. In his 6 months on the job, he had never heard a captain make such a request without specific cause. "Sir, what policy allows you to override a valid seat assignment?" Mitchell's face flushed red. "The policy that says I'm responsible for the safety and security of this aircraft. And when I determine that a passenger is inappropriate for their seating assignment, I have the authority to relocate them." Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward in her seat. "Captain, could you cite the specific regulation you're referring to? Because as a federal employee myself, I'm familiar with airline passenger rights, and what you're describing doesn't sound like any regulation I know." Mitchell spun toward her, his composure finally cracking. "Ma'am, unless you're an FAA inspector, your opinion is irrelevant, and if you continue to interfere, you'll be removed from this aircraft as well." The threat landed like a slap across the cabin. Several passengers gasped. Tyler Morrison's TikTok livestream, which now had over 3,000 viewers, exploded with comments. Did he just threaten a doctor? This captain has lost his mind. Someone, call the news. Record everything. James Sullivan stood up from his seat, his lawyer instincts fully engaged. "Captain, I am a civil rights attorney, and what you just described is not airline policy. It's discrimination." Mitchell's eyes blazed with fury. "Sir, sit down immediately, or you'll be joining them in the terminal. You're threatening to remove passengers for knowing their rights." Sullivan pulled out his phone and began recording openly. "Please continue, Captain. I'd like this on record." Isabella Martinez watched this escalation with growing horror. In her 3 years with Skywing, she had never seen a captain behave like this. Mitchell was threatening passengers for asking questions, making removal threats without basis, and creating exactly the kind of incident that would destroy careers and cost the airline millions. She pulled out her work phone and sent a text to her supervisor. "Emergency situation on Flight 382. Captain Mitchell removing passengers without cause. Please advise." The response came back immediately. "Document everything. Do not interfere unless passenger safety is at risk." Meanwhile, Sergeant Williams was coming to her own conclusions. She had worked enough of these situations to recognize the difference between legitimate security concerns and personal bias, masquerading as authority. Captain Mitchell was displaying all the classic signs of the latter. "Captain," she said firmly, "I need you to provide specific justification for this removal request. What safety or security threat does this passenger pose?" Mitchell gestured wildly toward Simone. She's clearly using stolen credentials to access seats she can't afford. I can spot fraud from a mile away, and this woman is running some kind of scam." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Several passengers inhaled sharply. Eleanor Washington gripped her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. Simone Crawford looked up at Captain Mitchell with the kind of calm that comes from having been underestimated her entire life. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried clearly throughout the cabin. "Captain Mitchell, you just accused me of credit card fraud and theft. Do you have any evidence to support those accusations, or are you basing them solely on my appearance?" The question was surgical in its precision. Mitchell realized too late that he had crossed a line from bias into outright defamation, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Lady, I don't need evidence when the evidence is sitting right in front of me. People like you don't just happen to have first-class money lying around." The phrase "people like you" detonated like a bomb in the enclosed space of the cabin. Dr. Rodriguez's mouth dropped open. James Sullivan's fingers flew across his phone screen as he documented the statement. Tyler's livestream viewer count jumped to 8,000 as viewers began sharing the stream across social media platforms. Frank Washington, the retired teacher from Birmingham, turned to his wife and whispered, "Did that man just say what I think he said?" Eleanor nodded grimly. "He said exactly what we both know he meant." Paul Henderson, the pharmaceutical executive who had been watching silently, finally spoke up. "Captain, as someone who flies first class regularly, I have to say your behavior is completely inappropriate. This passenger has done nothing wrong." Mitchell wheeled on him. "Mr. Henderson, you're a valued customer, and I respect your opinion. But you don't understand the challenges we face in maintaining security and order. Some passengers require more management than others." Management. Henderson's voice rose. "You mean passengers who don't look like me?" "I mean passengers who don't fit the profile for premium service." Mitchell shot back. "I'm sure you can understand the difference." Henderson stared at him in disgust. "Actually, Captain, I can't understand the difference at all. And frankly, your management is making me deeply uncomfortable." Sergeant Williams had heard enough. In 15 years of airport security, she had learned to recognize when a situation was about to spiral completely out of control. Captain Mitchell was making accusations without evidence, threatening passengers for asking questions and using language that bordered on hate speech. "Captain Mitchell," she said with the authority of someone who had dealt with far more dangerous situations than this, "I'm going to need you to step back and explain your specific concerns about this passenger's credentials." "I already explained." "No, sir. You made accusations. I need facts. What specific evidence do you have that this passenger's ticket is fraudulent?" Mitchell's face was now bright red. He was trapped between his bias and his inability to articulate any legitimate justification for it. The cabin full of recording phones wasn't helping his composure. "Sergeant, are you questioning my judgment? I'm a captain with 18 years of experience. I think I know a fake passenger when I see one. What makes a passenger fake, Captain?" The question was simple, direct, and devastating. Mitchell opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. He looked around the cabin at the sea of recording devices, at the passengers watching him with expressions ranging from disgust to fascination to horror. The passenger doesn't match the typical demographic profile for first-class service," he finally managed. Williams raised her eyebrows. "Could you clarify what you mean by demographic profile?" Before Mitchell could answer, Tyler Morrison's TikTok stream hit 15,000 viewers, and someone in the comments posted a link to Skywing Airline's Twitter account. Within minutes, people were flooding the airline's social media with clips from the live stream demanding answers. The hashtag #SkyWingShame began trending. Dr. Rodriguez, still recording, decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. For the record, she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I am Doctor." Amanda Rodriguez, a practicing cardiologist. I have flown with Captain Mitchell before, and I have witnessed this behavior previously. This is not about security or policy. This is about racial discrimination. Mitchell's eyes went wide. Dr. Rodriguez, that is a serious accusation, and I won't tolerate— You won't tolerate what— The truth. Rodriguez stood up, her phone still recording. 2 years ago on Flight 156, you spent 20 minutes questioning my credentials, demanding to see my medical license, suggesting that my first-class seat must have been some kind of mistake. I didn't speak up then, but I'm speaking up now. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Other passengers were nodding, remembering their own experiences or incidents they had witnessed. Isabella Martinez felt her resolve crystallizing. Her supervisor had told her to document everything, and she was about to document something that would probably cost her her job, but might save her conscience. "Captain," she said, stepping forward, "I've reviewed the passenger manifest. Ms. Crawford's ticket was purchased with a platinum corporate credit card registered to Crawford Aerospace Holdings. The payment cleared 3 weeks ago. There is no evidence of fraud or irregularity." Mitchell turned on her with fury. "Ms. Martinez, you are out of line. Return to your station immediately. Sir, I'm providing factual information from our reservation process. Information I didn't request and don't need. Your job is to follow orders, not to second-guess my decisions." Isabella felt something shift inside her chest. Her mother had cleaned houses for 50 years, never once speaking up when she was treated badly, always accepting whatever treatment she received because she needed the work. But Isabella had watched this passenger maintain her dignity in the face of outrageous treatment, had watched other passengers find their courage and speak truth to power. Maybe it was time for her to find hers. "Captain Mitchell," she said, her voice shaking but clear with respect, "your orders appear to violate company policy and federal anti-discrimination laws." The cabin went completely silent. Mitchell's face turned purple with rage. "Ms. Martinez, you are relieved of duty. Report to the gate immediately for disciplinary action." Isabella nodded calmly. She had expected this. But as she turned to leave, something unexpected happened. Paul Henderson stood up. "Captain, if you fire that flight attendant for telling the truth, I'm calling Skywing's corporate headquarters right now." Dr. Rodriguez stood up next. "And I'm calling the Federal Aviation Administration." James Sullivan rose from his seat. "And I'm calling the Department of Transportation's Office of Civil Rights." One by one, passengers throughout the first-class cabin stood up. Eleanor and Frank Washington. Tyler Morrison still live-streaming to an audience that had now grown to 25,000 viewers. A businessman from Dallas. A teacher from Houston. A college student headed home to Atlanta. They stood not because they were organized or because they had planned it, but because sometimes when you witness something fundamentally wrong, standing up becomes the only option that lets you live with yourself. Captain Mitchell looked around the cabin at the forest of standing passengers, the recording phones, the flight attendant he had just fired for telling the truth. For the first time since this confrontation began, he seemed to realize that he might have miscalculated. But it was far too late for second thoughts. Sergeant Williams looked at her partner, Officer Torres, who had been quietly filming the entire exchange with the body camera all security officers were required to wear. Torres nodded grimly. They both knew this footage would be reviewed by multiple agencies before the night was over. Captain Mitchell Williams said with finality, "I'm going to need you to provide concrete evidence of policy violations or security threats, or I'm going to have to ask you to allow this passenger to remain in her assigned seat." Mitchell looked around desperately, searching for support, for backup, for anything that might salvage the authority he felt slipping away from him. What he found instead was Simone Crawford looking up at him with an expression that was no longer calm or patient. It was the expression of someone who had given him every opportunity to do the right thing, and watched him choose badly at every turn. "Captain Mitchell," she said quietly, "I think it's time you knew who you're talking to." And with those words, everything was about to change. Simone Crawford reached down to her briefcase with the deliberate movements of someone who had been planning this moment for months. The leather case was expensive, but understated the kind of accessory that spoke of success without shouting about it. What Captain Mitchell couldn't see was that it contained technology that had been recording every word of their conversation since the moment he had first approached her seat. "Before I explain who I am," Simone said, her voice carrying a new authority that made several passengers lean forward in their seats, "I want to ensure that everyone understands exactly what has transpired here tonight." She opened the briefcase and withdrew a sleek tablet, its screen already glowing with data. "Captain Mitchell, for the past 18 minutes, you have accused me of fraud theft and using stolen credentials. You have threatened to remove me from my legally purchased seat based on your assessment of whether I belong in first class. You have threatened other passengers for questioning your authority. And you have fired a flight attendant for providing factual information that contradicted your assumptions." Captain Mitchell's face had gone from red to pale as he watched her produce what was clearly professional-grade recording equipment. "What? What is that?" "This," Simone said, turning the tablet so he could see the waveform patterns dancing across its screen, "is a real-time audio recording of our entire conversation, along with biometric analysis of voice stress patterns, automated transcription, and immediate cloud backup to secure servers." Dr. Rodriguez lowered her phone slightly, realizing that her amateur recording was being supplemented by something far more sophisticated. Simone touched a control on the tablet screen. Suddenly, Captain Mitchell's voice filled the cabin crystal clear, and unmistakably, "His people like you don't just happen to have first-class money lying around." Several passengers gasped. Hearing his words played back in his own voice seemed to hit Mitchell like a physical blow. And this Simone continued touching another control. Mitchell's voice again, "I can spot fraud from a mile away, and this woman is running some kind of scam." Tyler Morrison's live stream chat was exploding with viewers who couldn't believe what they were hearing. His viewer count had jumped to 40,000, and people were sharing the stream across every social media platform imaginable. The recordings, Simone explained calmly, are being transmitted in real time to federal investigators who have been monitoring potential civil rights violations in the airline industry. Everything Captain Mitchell has said tonight is now part of an official federal record. Isabella Martinez, who had been walking toward the gate after being fired, stopped in the aisle. She had assumed her career with Skywing was over, but listening to the playback of the captain's statements, she began to realize that she might not be the one losing her job tonight. Sergeant Williams stepped closer to Simone. "Ma'am, are you a federal agent?" "No," Simone replied. "I'm something much more problematic for Captain Mitchell. I'm the person who owns this airline." The words hit the cabin like a lightning strike. Complete silence for 3 heartbeats, then an explosion of whispers, gasps, and frantic typing as passengers rushed to share this development on social media. Captain Mitchell's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. That's impossible. You can't. Who are you?" Simone stood up for the first time since the confrontation began. At 5 feet 6 inches, she wasn't physically imposing, but something about her presence seemed to fill the entire cabin. "My name is Simone Crawford. I am the CEO and majority owner of Crawford Aerospace Holdings, a $4.2 billion aviation conglomerate. Through subsidiary companies and investment partnerships, Crawford Aerospace owns 67% of Skywing Airlines." She paused, letting the information sink in. "Captain Mitchell, you work for me." The silence that followed was so complete that the only sounds in the cabin were the hum of the aircraft's electrical equipment and the distant noise of ground crews outside. Mitchell's face had gone completely white. His hands were shaking slightly as the full magnitude of his situation began to dawn on him. That's not... I've never heard of... He was stumbling over his words, his authority completely evaporated. You've never heard of Crawford Aerospace because we own airlines through holding companies and shell corporations, Simone explained patiently. It's a common structure in the aviation industry. But I can assure you that Skywing's corporate hierarchy is quite familiar with Crawford Aerospace. In fact, your CEO reports to my board of directors quarterly. James Sullivan was typing furiously on his phone, pulling up corporate records and SEC filings. Within seconds, he had confirmed what Simone had just revealed. Crawford Aerospace was indeed a major player in the aviation industry, and Skywing Airlines was listed as a subsidiary holding. Holy shit, he whispered, then looked around embarrassedly. Sorry, but this is real. Crawford Aerospace. She's telling the truth. Dr. Rodriguez was staring at Simone with something approaching awe. You've been investigating the airline. The discrimination complaints. For 6 months, Simone confirmed. We received 47 complaints about discriminatory treatment on Skywing flights over the past 5 years. 47 passengers who were questioned, moved, or removed from their seats based on assumptions about whether they belonged there. The complaints mentioned certain flight crews repeatedly. She looked directly at Mitchell. Your name appeared in 31 of those complaints, Captain. Mitchell's knees seemed to give out slightly. He gripped the back of a seat for support. Those complaints were investigated. They were found to be without merit. They were buried, Simone corrected, by a legal department that decided settling quietly was cheaper than addressing the underlying problem. But Crawford Aerospace doesn't settle. We solve problems permanently. Tyler Morrison's live stream had now reached 75,000 viewers. Comments were flowing so fast they were impossible to read, but the hashtags were clear. Simone Crawford Aerospace Skywing Scandal. News outlets were picking up the story in real time. Eleanor Washington turned to her husband with tears in her eyes. Frank, do you understand what just happened? This woman owned the airline the whole time, and she let him humiliate himself completely. Frank nodded slowly. Sometimes the best way to expose a structure is to let it show you exactly who it really is. Isabella Martinez felt her phone buzzing with text messages from her supervisor, but she ignored them. She was watching something unprecedented unfold. A passenger who had absorbed discrimination documented it professionally and was about to dismantle the entire structure that had allowed it to happen. Sergeant Williams looked between Simone and Captain Mitchell with the expression of someone who had just watched a routine passenger dispute transform into a corporate scandal of epic proportions. Ms. Crawford, she said carefully, what would you like us to do with this situation? For now, nothing. Captain Mitchell is going to finish explaining his passenger removal policies to everyone in this cabin. Then he's going to explain them to federal investigators. Then he's going to explain them to my board of directors. Simone's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. But first, I want everyone to hear exactly what kind of training leads to this behavior. She touched another control on her tablet. The cabin's public address setup crackled to life, and Captain Mitchell's voice filled the aircraft. I trust my 18 years of experience over some computer algorithm that doesn't understand the reality of aviation. Then his voice again. Some passengers require more management than others. And again, people like you don't fit the profile for premium service. With each playback, Mitchell seemed to shrink a little more. The other passengers were staring at him with expressions ranging from disgust to pity to fascination at watching a career self-destruct in real time. Paul Henderson, the pharmaceutical executive, stood up and faced Mitchell directly. Captain, I've flown with you at least a dozen times over the past few years. You've always been respectful to me, professional, courteous. Now I understand why. I fit your profile. Mitchell opened his mouth to respond, but Henderson held up his hand. I'm not finished. I need to know when you were being respectful to me. Were you being disrespectful to passengers who didn't look like me? When you were ensuring my comfort, were you making other passengers uncomfortable? When you were protecting my premium experience, were you degrading theirs? The questions hung in the air like accusations. Mitchell had no answers that wouldn't make his situation worse. Dr. Rodriguez was still recording, but now she was focused on the other passengers' reactions. This is what accountability looks like, she said to her phone camera. This is what happens when someone with real power decides to use it for justice instead of revenge. Simone touched her tablet screen again, and this time a different voice filled the cabin. A woman's voice, professional and crisp. Ms. Crawford, this is Elena Vasquez at Crawford Legal. We have federal investigators standing by, and Skywing's board of directors is assembling for an emergency session. How would you like to proceed? Mitchell's eyes went wide as he realized the recording apparatus was actually a live communication link. Elena Simone said clearly, "Please inform the board that Captain Mitchell has provided extensive documentation of discriminatory practices through his own statements tonight. Also inform them that flight attendant Isabella Martinez attempted to prevent this incident by providing factual information and was fired for her efforts." Isabella gasped. She hadn't expected to be mentioned, let alone protected. Finally, Simone continued, "Please patch this communication to the cabin audio so that Captain Mitchell can participate directly in the discussion of his future with this company." Elena's voice came back immediately, patching through now. "Skywing CEO David Richardson is on the line." A new voice filled the cabin, older, gravelly, tense. "Ms. Crawford, this is David Richardson. I understand we have a situation." David Simone said, her tone now carrying the full authority of a majority shareholder addressing a subordinate. "We have Captain Derek Mitchell on Flight 382, who has spent the past 25 minutes providing a masterclass in exactly the kind of discriminatory behavior that generated 47 complaints over 5 years. The entire incident has been recorded and is being live-streamed by passengers to approximately 80,000 viewers." Richardson's voice carried a note of panic. 80,000 viewers, and growing. "Captain Mitchell has accused me of fraud and theft, threatened multiple passengers, and fired a flight attendant for providing accurate information. All based on his assessment of my appearance and his assumption that I don't belong in first class." There was a long pause before Richardson spoke again. "Captain Mitchell, are you on this channel?" Mitchell's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, sir. Captain, is Ms. Crawford's description of events accurate?" Mitchell looked around the cabin at the sea of recording devices at the passengers who had witnessed everything at the flight attendant he had fired for telling the truth. He was trapped between confession and perjury, between accountability and denial. "Sir, the passenger was... I believed there was a security concern." Simone's voice cut through his stammering. "David, would you like to hear the specific language Captain Mitchell used to describe his security concerns?" And with that question, she prepared to play the recordings that would end not just Mitchell's career, but change the entire culture of airline passenger service forever. The tension in the cabin was so thick, it seemed to press against the windows. Captain Mitchell stood frozen in the aisle, sweat beading on his forehead, his hands shaking as he realized that everything he had said was about to be broadcast to his CEO through the aircraft's communication setup. Simone Crawford touched the tablet screen with the deliberate precision of a surgeon making a critical incision. Captain Mitchell's voice filled the cabin crystal clear through the aircraft's speakers. "People like you don't sit up here. This isn't a charity bus or some holiday freebie. Front seats are for people who belong, not for tourists who wander into places they don't understand." In the stunned silence that followed, CEO David Richardson's voice came through the speakers with barely controlled fury. "Captain Mitchell, did you actually say those words to a passenger?" Mitchell's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Around him, 43 passengers and 2 security officers waited for his response. Tyler Morrison's livestream had reached over 100,000 viewers, with major news outlets now picking up the feed and rebroadcasting it across their platforms. Sir, I was attempting to maintain order in the cabin. Simone touched the tablet again. Mitchell's voice. Let me guess. Some last-minute miracle upgrade. This isn't a storybook. It's Monday night, not Christmas morning. Another touch. I've been flying for 18 years. I've seen every scam, every fake boarding pass, every charity case trying to talk their way into seats they can't afford. And another I can spot fraud from a mile away, and this woman is running some kind of scam. With each playback, Captain Mitchell seemed to physically diminish. His shoulders sagged, his face went pale, and his authority evaporated like water in the desert. Jesus Christ. Mitchell. Richardson's voice crackled through the speakers. Have you completely lost your mind? Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward in her seat, her medical training kicking in as she watched a human being experience complete professional destruction in real time. Despite everything Mitchell had done, despite the discrimination and humiliation he had inflicted, she found herself feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and pity. James Sullivan was documenting everything on his phone, but as a lawyer, he was also calculating the legal ramifications. This is unprecedented, he whispered to Paul Henderson. I've never seen someone create their own evidence for a discrimination lawsuit this thoroughly. Isabella Martinez stood in the aisle, tears streaming down her face. She had been prepared to lose her job for standing up to Captain Mitchell, but now she was watching him lose his career for exactly the behavior she had tried to prevent. Simone wasn't finished. She touched the tablet again, and this time, Elena Vasquez's voice joined the conversation. Mr. Richardson. We also have Captain Mitchell's statements threatening passengers for questioning his authority. Mitchell's voice again. Ma'am, unless you're an FAA inspector, your opinion is irrelevant. And if you continue to interfere, you'll be removed from this aircraft as well. And sir, sit down immediately, or you'll be joining them in the terminal. And perhaps most damaging, Sergeant, are you questioning my judgment? I'm a captain with 18 years of experience. I think I know a fake passenger when I see one. Richardson's voice was now audibly shaking with rage. Mitchell, you threatened to remove passengers for asking questions. You called a paying customer a fake passenger. Have you completely forgotten every training session, every policy manual, every basic principle of customer service? Sir, I was trying to maintain the integrity of the first-class cabin. The integrity of the first-class cabin. Richardson's voice rose to nearly a shout. You've just destroyed the integrity of this entire airline. Sergeant Williams stepped closer to Captain Mitchell, her expression professional but sympathetic. She had seen careers end before, but rarely with such completeness and finality. Captain, she said quietly, I think you should consider remaining silent until you can speak with legal representation. But Mitchell was beyond rational thought. The magnitude of his mistake was crushing him, and in his desperation he made the worst possible choice. He tried to justify himself. Mr. Richardson, sir, I've been protecting this airline's premium brand for 18 years. I've maintained standards that ensure our first-class passengers receive the experience they expect. Sometimes that requires making difficult decisions about passenger placement. The words seemed to echo in the cabin like gunshots. Simone Crawford stood up slowly, her expression shifting from calm observation to controlled fury. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had built an empire and wasn't about to watch it be tarnished by bigotry. Captain Mitchell. She said her words audible to everyone in the cabin and everyone listening through the communication setup. You just described racial profiling as customer service. You just called discrimination maintaining standards. And you just revealed that this behavior isn't an aberration. It's your standard operating procedure. She turned to address the passengers around her. but her words were really meant for the thousands of people listening through Tyler's live stream and the hundreds of thousands more who would see this footage in the hours to come. Ladies and gentlemen, you are witnessing exactly why Crawford Aerospace launched this investigation. Captain Mitchell's behavior tonight isn't unusual. It's representative. For 5 years, passengers like you have been filing complaints about treatment just like this. And for 5 years, those complaints have been buried, dismissed, or explained away. She looked directly at Mitchell, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of judgment. But tonight, Captain Mitchell decided to discriminate against the wrong passenger. Tonight, he chose to humiliate someone who had the power to ensure that this behavior never happens again. Elena Vasquez's voice came through the speakers. Ms. Crawford, we have federal civil rights investigators on the line requesting permission to join this conversation. Granted, Simone replied without hesitation. A new voice filled the cabin official and stern. This is Agent Sarah Martinez with the Department of Transportation's Office of Aviation Consumer Protection. Captain Mitchell, you are being recorded for a federal investigation into potential civil rights violations. Mitchell's knees finally gave out completely. He sank into the nearest empty seat, his head in his hands. Furthermore, Agent Martinez continued, Mr. Richardson Crawford, Aerospace has provided us with extensive documentation of similar incidents spanning 5 years. This investigation will encompass not just Captain Mitchell's behavior, but Skywing Airline's response to previous complaints. Richardson's voice was now barely audible. Agent Martinez, I want you to know that Skywing Airlines will cooperate fully with your investigation. That's fortunate, Mr. Richardson, because cooperation isn't optional. We'll be requiring access to all personnel files, training records, and complaint documentation for the past 5 years. Tyler Morrison was struggling to keep up with the comments on his live stream. News outlets were requesting permission to use his footage. Politicians were demanding investigations. Civil rights organizations were calling for industry-wide reforms. The hashtag Skywing Scandal was trending #1 worldwide. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Eleanor Washington, the elderly retired teacher from Birmingham, stood up in her seat and addressed Captain Mitchell directly. Young man, she said, her voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of fighting discrimination, my husband and I have been flying for 40 years. We've been questioned, moved, removed, and humiliated by people who looked at our skin color and decided we didn't belong. We've filed complaints that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. We've accepted treatment we shouldn't have accepted because we thought we had no choice. She paused, looking around the cabin at the recording devices, at the passengers listening intently at the communication apparatus that was broadcasting her words to federal investigators. But tonight, we watched someone with real power choose to use that power for justice instead of revenge. Ms. Crawford could have revealed who she was immediately and ended your behavior with a phone call. Instead, she let you reveal exactly who you are in your own words, with your own choices. Her husband Frank stood up beside her. That's what accountability looks like, Captain. That's what justice looks like when it's served properly. Captain Mitchell looked up at the elderly couple, tears streaming down his face. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he was seeing the human cost of his assumptions, the dignity he had denied, the opportunities he had stolen with his biases. I never meant. He started, but Frank Washington held up his hand. Son, intent doesn't matter when the impact is discrimination. You meant to maintain what you saw as order, but what you actually maintained was injustice. Dr. Rodriguez had stopped recording. What she was witnessing was beyond documentation. It was transformation. Real change happening in real time, not through protest or petition, but through truth and consequence. Isabella Martinez walked back to Captain Mitchell and knelt down beside his seat. Despite everything he had done to her, despite the job he had cost her, she felt compelled to offer what comfort she could to a fellow human being experiencing complete destruction. "Captain," she said quietly, "I've watched you work for 3 years. I know you're not evil, but I also know you hurt people, and hurting people was never okay no matter what you believed about maintaining standards." Mitchell looked at her through his tears. "Isabella, I fired you. You tried to stop this and I fired you." "Yes," she said simply. "You did." The simplicity of her response, no anger, no condemnation, just acknowledgement, seemed to break something inside him. Through the communication setup, Elena Vasquez announced, "Ms. Crawford, the Skywing Board of Directors is prepared to implement immediate policy changes." "Excellent," Simone replied. "But before we discuss policy changes, I want Captain Mitchell to understand the full scope of what has happened tonight." She touched her tablet again, and the screen displayed a real-time social media feed. Millions of people watching, sharing, commenting. News alerts from major networks. Statements from civil rights organizations. Stock price fluctuations for Crawford Aerospace and Skywing's parent company. "Captain Mitchell, she said your statements tonight have been heard by over 2 million people and counting. Your behavior has triggered federal investigations, congressional inquiries, and industry-wide policy reviews. In 25 minutes, you have single-handedly created the largest airline discrimination scandal in modern history." She paused, letting the magnitude sink in. "But here's what I want you to understand. This isn't about destroying you personally. This is about ensuring that no passenger ever experiences what I experienced tonight, what Dr. Rodriguez experienced, what the Washingtons have experienced, what countless others have experienced in silence." She looked around the cabin at the faces watching her, some angry, some awed, some simply grateful that someone with power had chosen to use it wisely. "Justice," she said, "isn't about revenge. It's about making sure the structure works for everyone, not just for people who look like they belong." And with those words, she prepared to transform not just Captain Mitchell's career, but the entire airline industry. The silence that followed Simone's words was broken by Elena Vasquez's voice coming through the aircraft's communications setup with surgical precision. "Captain Derek Mitchell, by the authority vested in Crawford Aerospace as majority shareholders of Skywing Airlines, your employment is hereby terminated, effective immediately." The words hit the cabin like a physical force. Mitchell's head snapped up, his eyes wide with the shock of finality. Around him, passengers seemed to collectively hold their breath, witnessing the moment when accountability became reality. Furthermore, Elena continued, "Federal investigators are en route to Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Captain Mitchell, you will remain on this aircraft until they arrive to document your statements and conduct preliminary interviews regarding potential civil rights violations." Agent Sarah Martinez's voice joined the conversation. "Captain Mitchell, you are not under arrest at this time, but I strongly advise you to exercise your right to remain silent until you can consult with legal representation. But the consequences were only beginning. Mr. Richardson." Elena's voice continued. "The Skywing Board of Directors has voted unanimously to implement immediate policy changes. Effective tonight, all passenger removal decisions must be approved by ground supervisors with documented justification. All crew members will undergo mandatory civil rights training within 30 days, and a passenger advocacy position will be created to investigate discrimination complaints." David Richardson's voice came through the speakers, shaky but resolute. The board also voted to offer Ms. Isabella Martinez immediate reinstatement with a promotion to lead flight attendant, along with a formal commendation for ethical intervention. Isabella Martinez gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. 3 minutes ago, she had thought her career was over. Now she was being publicly vindicated and promoted. Tyler Morrison's live stream had reached 300,000 concurrent viewers. His phone was overheating from the processing load, and he was getting direct messages from news producers at CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and international outlets. The story was going global in real time. But perhaps more importantly, other passengers were beginning to share their own stories in the comments. Stories of discrimination, of being questioned, of being made to feel unwelcome on flights. The hashtag airline accountability was trending alongside Skywing scandal, and passengers across the country were posting their own experiences with airline bias. Dr. Rodriguez stood up and addressed the cabin directly. "I want everyone to understand what we just witnessed. This wasn't just about one passenger and one captain. This was about a power structure that allowed discrimination to flourish because passengers had no recourse, no voice, and no way to make their complaints heard." She turned to face the camera on Tyler's stream. Ms. Crawford could have pulled rank at any point tonight. She could have ended this confrontation with a phone call. Instead, she let Captain Mitchell reveal the full extent of his bias, documenting everything, building an airtight case, not just against him personally, but against the entire structure that enabled him. James Sullivan, the civil rights lawyer, was already drafting emails to his colleagues. This footage would become a training tool for discrimination cases, a textbook example of how bias manifests in positions of authority. What we saw tonight, he announced to the cabin, was the difference between individual accountability and structural change. Captain Mitchell is facing personal consequences, but more importantly, the entire airline industry is about to face institutional change. Agent Martinez's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your patience during this incident. Your testimony and documentation will be crucial to our investigation. We'll need contact information from anyone willing to provide statements." Every hand in the cabin went up, but the most powerful moment came when Frank Washington stood up again and addressed Captain Mitchell directly. "Son," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "in 1961, my wife and I were arrested for sitting in the white section of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. We were told we didn't belong there, just like you told Ms. Crawford she didn't belong in first class." He walked slowly toward Mitchell's seat, his wife Eleanor beside him. "The difference is that tonight justice was served immediately. Tonight, the power structure that allowed discrimination was exposed and changed in real time. That's progress, son. That's what the last 60 years of struggle have been building toward." Eleanor Washington placed her hand gently on Mitchell's shoulder. "We forgive you," she said quietly, "not because what you did was acceptable, but because forgiveness is how we heal. But forgiveness doesn't mean there shouldn't be consequences." Mitchell looked up at this elderly couple who had experienced far worse discrimination than anything he had ever faced, and something fundamental shifted in his understanding. "Mrs. Washington," he said, his voice barely audible, I never thought about it that way. I never thought about who I was hurting." Frank nodded slowly. "That's the problem, son. When you have power, not thinking about who you're hurting is the same as choosing to hurt them." Through the communication setup, Elena Vasquez announced another development. "Ms. Crawford, we've received calls from the CEOs of 12 major airlines requesting information about Crawford Aerospace's discrimination detection protocols. The industry wants to implement similar monitoring immediately." Simone smiled for the first time since the incident began. This was what she had been working toward. Not just justice for herself, but transformation of an entire industry. "Elena, schedule a conference call for tomorrow morning. We're going to make our monitoring technology open source. Discrimination shouldn't be a competitive advantage for anyone." Paul Henderson, the pharmaceutical executive, stood up and addressed the cabin. "I want to apologize to everyone here, especially to Ms. Crawford. I've flown first class hundreds of times over the past 20 years. I've been treated with automatic respect and courtesy. It never occurred to me that other passengers weren't receiving the same treatment." He turned to face Tyler's live stream camera. "If you're watching this and you look like me, I want you to ask yourself, when you've received excellent service, respectful treatment, and immediate accommodation, were other passengers being denied those same courtesies? Because after tonight, that's a question I can never stop asking." Isabella Martinez approached Simone Crawford with tears streaming down her face. "Ms. Crawford, I don't know how to thank you. 3 minutes ago I thought my career was over for standing up for what's right." Isabella Simone replied, "You didn't need me to protect you. You protected yourself by choosing truth over comfort. The promotion is just the company recognizing what you already proved tonight." But the ripple effects were extending far beyond the aircraft. News outlets were interrupting regular programming with breaking news alerts. The stock market was reacting in real time. Crawford Aerospace shares up 18% on news of their discrimination detection technology, while major airline stocks were declining as investors worried about potential liability. Congressional representatives were issuing statements calling for industry-wide investigations. Civil rights organizations were hailing the incident as a watershed moment. And most importantly, passengers across the country were sharing their own stories of airline discrimination, creating a national conversation about bias in transportation. Agent Martinez provided another update. "Ms. Crawford, the Federal Aviation Administration has fast-tracked approval for your discrimination detection technology to be implemented industry-wide. What normally would take years of bureaucratic review will be completed within 60 days. "Excellent," Simone replied. "But I want everyone to understand, this technology isn't about punishing employees. It's about creating accountability structures that protect both passengers and employees from discrimination." She looked around the cabin at the faces watching her. Some still in shock, others filled with admiration, all changed by what they had witnessed. Tonight proved something important when discriminatory behavior is exposed completely. When the full extent of bias is documented and broadcast, the response from institutions is swift and comprehensive. But it only works if people are willing to stand up and bear witness. Dr. Rodriguez raised her phone, still recording Ms. Crawford. "What message do you have for passengers who experience discrimination but don't have your resources, your power, or your ability to fight back?" Simone's expression grew serious. "Record everything. Document everything. Share everything. Tonight worked because technology allowed real-time documentation and broadcasting. Every passenger has that power now. Use it." She paused, looking directly into the camera. "But more importantly, understand that your dignity doesn't depend on convincing anyone that you belong somewhere. You belong wherever you have the right to be. Full stop." Tyler Morrison's comment section was exploding with passengers sharing their own discrimination experiences, but also with stories of allies who had spoken up, employees who had intervened, and moments when the structure had worked correctly. The conversation was expanding beyond just racial discrimination to include bias based on age, disability, gender, sexual orientation, and economic status. Simone's confrontation with Captain Mitchell had become a catalyst for a much larger discussion about power privilege and accountability in service industries. Elena Vasquez provided a final update. "Ms. Crawford, we've received confirmation that the Department of Transportation will be establishing a new Office of Transportation Equity with permanent staff dedicated to investigating discrimination complaints and implementing preventive measures industry-wide." "That's excellent news, Elena. But the real measure of success won't be the policies we implement. It will be whether passengers like Eleanor and Frank Washington ever have to experience what they experienced tonight." As if summoned by her words, Eleanor Washington stood up one final time. "Ms. Crawford, my husband and I have been fighting discrimination for 70 years. Tonight is the first time we've seen someone with real power use it immediately and completely to protect people like us." She looked around the cabin, her eyes bright with tears. This is what justice looks like when it moves at the speed of truth instead of the speed of bureaucracy. Frank Washington nodded. "And this is what accountability looks like when it's delivered by people who understand that with great power comes great responsibility to use it wisely." Captain Derek Mitchell, who had been sitting silently through the celebration and policy announcements, finally spoke. "Ms. Crawford, I know this doesn't change anything, and I know it's too late, but I need you to know that I understand now what I was doing. I understand who I was hurting." Simone looked at him with an expression that was neither forgiving nor condemning. Captain Mitchell understanding is the first step toward change. But understanding without action is just intellectual exercise. She paused, considering her words carefully. "If you truly understand what you did wrong, then spend the rest of your career, whatever career you have left, making sure other people in positions of authority don't make the same mistakes." And with those words, she had transformed not just one man's understanding, but an entire industry's approach to accountability and justice. The aircraft sat at the gate no longer a transportation vehicle, but a courtroom, a classroom, and a catalyst for change. In 45 minutes, a routine passenger confrontation had become a national conversation about dignity, justice, and the responsibility that comes with power. But the story wasn't over yet. 6 months later, Simone Crawford boarded Skywing Flight 382 from Dallas to Atlanta, the same route where her confrontation with Captain Derek Mitchell had changed an entire industry. She purchased her ticket under her real name this time. No disguise, no covert investigation. She wanted to see how the airline industry had truly changed. The gate agent, a young black woman named Keisha Johnson, looked up from her computer screen and smiled warmly. "Ms. Crawford, welcome aboard. Your seat in first class is ready, and I wanted to personally thank you for everything you've done for airline employees like me." As Simone walked down the jet bridge, she reflected on the transformation that had swept through the aviation industry like wildfire. The Crawford accountability protocols had been implemented by every major airline in the United States within 90 days. Real-time discrimination monitoring, mandatory bias training, passenger advocacy positions, and most importantly, a culture where speaking up was rewarded instead of punished. The flight attendant who greeted her at the aircraft door was Isabella Martinez, now head of diversity and inclusion training for Skywing Airlines. Isabella had become the face of employee empowerment, traveling across the country to train crews on recognizing and preventing discrimination. Ms. Crawford Isabella said with a genuine smile, "Welcome back to Flight 382. I have something special to show you." She led Simone to seat 2A, the same seat where everything had changed 6 months ago. But now, mounted on the wall beside the seat, was a small plaque, in honor of all passengers who have stood up for dignity and justice. Your courage creates change. The passengers from that night requested this, Isabella explained. Dr. Rodriguez designed it. The Washingtons paid for it, and Tyler Morrison organized the campaign to have it installed. They wanted future passengers to know that standing up for what's right isn't just possible, it's necessary. As Simone settled into her seat, she noticed that the passenger demographics in first class had noticeably changed. Where once the cabin had been predominantly white and male, now she saw families of different ethnicities, women traveling alone, elderly passengers who looked comfortable and welcome, young professionals from diverse backgrounds. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez was seated across the aisle, traveling to a medical conference in Atlanta. When she saw Simone, her face lit up with recognition. "Ms. Crawford, I was hoping I might see you on this route. I wanted you to know that I've become something of an accidental activist since that night. I've been speaking at conferences about the importance of bystander intervention and documenting discrimination." She pulled out her phone and showed Simone a video message with over 2 million views. How one woman's courage changed everything. Lessons from Flight 382. The video has inspired hundreds of passengers to share their own stories and stand up against discrimination in real time, Dr. Rodriguez explained. People are no longer staying silent when they witness bias. As the aircraft filled with passengers, Simone was struck by the atmosphere. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with genuine warmth, treating every passenger with equal respect regardless of their appearance or seat assignment. The tension and judgment that had characterized her previous flights on this route had been replaced by something revolutionary, simple human dignity. Tyler Morrison, now a college senior and part-time civil rights activist, was seated in economy but stopped by Simone's seat before takeoff. His TikTok livestream from that night had become a documentary watched by over 50 million people worldwide. Ms. Crawford, I wanted you to know that live streaming discrimination has become a movement. Passengers across the country are using social media to expose bias in real time, and airlines are responding immediately because they know the whole world is watching. He showed her his phone displaying a new app called Equality Alert that allowed passengers to instantly report and document discriminatory behavior, automatically notifying civil rights organizations and media outlets. Your confrontation with Captain Mitchell proved that transparency is the most powerful tool for change, Tyler continued. When discrimination happens in darkness, it continues. When it happens in the light of public scrutiny, it stops immediately. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Simone reflected on Captain Mitchell's fate. He had been fired from Skywing, investigated by federal authorities, and ultimately pleaded guilty to civil rights violations. But rather than simply disappearing, he had chosen a different path. Mitchell now worked for the Transportation Equity Initiative, traveling to airlines and other transportation companies to train supervisors on recognizing their own biases. His presentations began with a full recording of his behavior on Flight 382, followed by his personal journey from prejudice to understanding. I was the problem, he would tell audiences of airline employees. I thought I was maintaining standards, but I was actually enforcing inequality. The worst part wasn't that I was discriminating. It was that I didn't even realize I was doing it. His transformation had become almost as powerful as Simone's original confrontation, proving that even people who have caused tremendous harm can become forces for positive change when they truly understand the impact of their actions. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Sarah Chen. Welcome aboard Flight 382 to Atlanta. Before we take off, I want to remind everyone that this aircraft operates under the Crawford protocols, which means every passenger is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background appearance or seat assignment. Captain Chen was part of a new generation of airline leaders who had been promoted specifically because of their commitment to equality and inclusion. Skywing now required all captains to complete advanced training on passenger rights and cultural competency. As the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude, Isabella Martinez made an announcement that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Isabella Martinez, your head flight attendant. I want to let you know that if you experience any form of discrimination or bias during this flight, you can immediately contact our passenger advocacy hotline by pressing the call button and asking for advocacy support. Your concerns will be addressed immediately and confidentially. The announcement received spontaneous applause from passengers throughout the cabin. Eleanor and Frank Washington were seated in first class, an upgrade they had received as part of Skywing's Passenger Appreciation Program for civil rights advocates. At 71, they had finally lived to see the day when their dignity was automatically respected rather than constantly questioned. Simone Eleanor said during the flight, Frank and I have been talking about that night 6 months ago. We realized that what made it so powerful wasn't just that you had the power to fight back. It was that you chose to let him expose himself completely before you used that power. Frank nodded thoughtfully. You could have stopped his behavior immediately, but instead you documented it thoroughly. That documentation became the foundation for changing the entire industry. The individual justice was satisfying, Simone replied, but the changes that followed have prevented thousands of other passengers from experiencing what we experienced. That's what makes it worthwhile. As Flight 382 began its descent into Atlanta, Simone looked around the cabin one final time. The change was visible in ways both obvious and subtle. The diversity of passengers in first class, the respectful treatment from crew members, the absence of tension and judgment that had once characterized air travel for so many people. But perhaps most importantly, she saw something that hadn't existed 6 months ago. Passengers who looked comfortable, welcomed, and secure in their right to be wherever they belonged. The aircraft touched down smoothly in Atlanta, and as passengers began to deplane, many stopped to thank Simone personally. Some shared their own stories of discrimination that had ended because of the changes her confrontation had triggered. Others simply wanted to express gratitude for her courage. As Simone walked through the terminal, she passed a wall display that had been installed in airports across the country. The Crawford Principles of Transportation Equity, outlining passenger rights and reporting procedures for discrimination. At the bottom of the display, in simple but powerful language, was the core message that had emerged from that confrontational night 6 months ago. Dignity is not negotiable. Justice is not optional. Equality is not a privilege. It is a right that belongs to every passenger on every flight, every single time. Standing in the busy Atlanta terminal, watching passengers of every background move freely and confidently through the space, Simone Crawford smiled with deep satisfaction. The young woman who had been denied boarding 25 years ago, who had slept in an airport rather than accept discrimination, had not just built an empire. She had used that empire to ensure that no one would ever have to sleep in an airport again because of the color of their skin. Justice, she had learned, isn't about getting revenge on the people who hurt you. Justice is about building a world where what hurt you can never hurt anyone else. And on this day in this terminal, surrounded by the proof of that transformation, Simone Crawford knew that her grandmother's inheritance had been invested wisely. She had indeed bought something special, something that shows you belong in this world. She had bought change, and that change would last forever. If this story moved you, if you believe that dignity should never depend on someone knowing your position, if you think justice should move at the speed of truth instead of the speed of bureaucracy, then share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button to support stories that matter. Subscribe to Dignity Voices because we're not just telling stories. We're changing the world one conversation at a time. Have you ever witnessed discrimination? Have you ever been judged before you were known? Drop your story in the comments below because your voice matters, your experience counts, and together we can ensure that what happened to Simone never happens to anyone else. Remember, you don't need to own the company to demand respect. You just need the courage to stand up and the wisdom to document everything. Your phone is your power, your voice is your weapon, and your dignity is your right. Until next time, stay brave, stay vigilant, and never forget that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice